The chamber had been silent for 11 seconds before Ambassador Veth realized that silence itself was the answer. She had expected an argument. She had prepared for negotiation. The Conclave's legal team had drafted 17 contingency responses to 17 possible human objections, each one refined over 4 months of interstellar transit, each one anticipating a different shade of human desperation or defiance. What none of them had anticipated was this: the human delegate, a woman named Coordinator Mara Olin, setting down her translation earpiece on the table with a small, careful click, folding her hands and saying nothing at all. The document between them was 300 pages long. Its final paragraph contained a demand that had never before been issued to any spacefaring civilization in 4,000 years of conclave governance. Veth had expected the humans to argue about it. She had expected them to stall, to posture, to appeal to galactic law. She had expected them to do anything except sit quietly and look at her with an expression she could not, for reasons that deeply disturbed her, decode. The silence stretched to 14 seconds, then 15. Veth noticed that Olin's hands were not trembling. She noticed that the two human observers seated behind Olin, a young man with a scar across his jaw and an older woman whose hair had gone entirely white, were not exchanging glances the way frightened subordinates typically did. They were watching Veth. All three of them were watching Veth in a way that made the ambassador feel, for the first time in a distinguished 40-year diplomatic career, that she was the one who had walked into an unfamiliar room. She told herself this was irrational. The Conclave had 47 member civilizations. Humanity had been spacefaring for barely 130 years. The document on the table represented the collective decision of a governing body whose oldest member civilization predated human writing. Veth was not the one in an unfamiliar room. She told herself this clearly and precisely, and the silence continued, and Coordinator Olin's expression did not change, and for reasons Veth could not immediately explain, the ambassador felt the first cold edge of something she would not call fear because she was a professional, but which moved through her the way fear moved. "You've read the document," Veth said finally. Her translator rendered it in Terran standard with perfect fidelity. "Twice," Olin said. "Then you understand the Conclave's position." "I understand what the document says," Olin replied, and there was something in the precision of that phrasing, the gap between what the document said and what the Conclave's position actually was, that Veth filed away and decided to examine later. "The demand is non-negotiable," Veth said. "The full disclosure and transfer of all human weapon systems, active or archived, conventional or experimental, including any systems currently in development, to a Conclave-managed repository pending review. The Conclave Security Commission will assess each system and determine what, if anything, is returned. Compliance is required within 90 days. "I know," Olin said, and... Olin picked up her earpiece from the table and turned it over in her fingers, not to put it on, just to hold it. She looked at it for a moment the way someone looks at an object they have decided to stop pretending they need. "We'll need some time to discuss it," she said. "The Conclave, not with you," Olin said. "Internally, we'll need some time to discuss it internally." She stood, and so did her two observers, with a smoothness that Veth noticed was not the smoothness of people who had rehearsed the gesture but of people who had stopped needing to rehearse anything. "We'll contact you by end of week." She left the translation earpiece on the table. Veth watched them go. She sat in the chamber for a long time afterward, surrounded by her legal team, and none of them said anything, and the silence was entirely different from the silence before. Because before, Veth had thought the humans were speechless. Now she was no longer sure who had been silent at whom. The formal request had originated from an incident 40 months earlier that the Conclave's internal communications referred to as the Keyleth Margin event, and that humanity, Veth had since learned, referred to by a completely different name whose translation did not map cleanly onto any language in the Conclave database. The closest rendering was something like the quiet, or possibly the patience, or in certain dialects the waiting that was not waiting. The ambiguity was deliberate, the Conclave's linguistic analysts had concluded. They had concluded this without quite being able to explain what exactly had been deliberate about it. The event itself had been documented by 3 Conclave observation vessels, stationed in the Keyleth Margin for a routine cartographic survey. The human colony ship Perseverance had been traveling through the same region when it encountered a debris field from a Veth military engagement 2 years prior, an engagement that the Conclave had classified, and in the formal language of interstellar governance resolved. The debris field contained 3 live munitions of Veth manufacture, each one carrying a payload sufficient to reduce a moon to slag. What the Perseverance had done with those munitions was what had generated the request. The observation vessels had watched. They had recorded everything with a thoroughness their crews would later describe in depositions as making them uncomfortable in retrospect. The Perseverance had not destroyed the munitions, which would have been the logical response. It had not called for conclave assistance, which would have been the expected response. It had not altered course to avoid the debris field, because two of the munitions were on the edge of a proximity trigger threshold, and any course change of sufficient magnitude would have detonated them. What it had done was spend 19 days in the debris field. 19 days. Veth had looked at that number many times, and it did not become more comprehensible with repetition. The Perseverance carried 4,200 colonists and a crew of 300. For 19 days, using equipment that was by conclave standards primitive and by human standards apparently ordinary, the crew had moved through the debris field with the 3 live munitions and done something to each of them that the observation vessels had recorded but whose purpose the analysts had not 4 months later fully agreed upon. The result was that the munitions no longer functioned, not because they had been destroyed. Because something had been done to their interior architecture that made the observers feel, when they reviewed the footage, that the munitions had been reasoned with. This was not a technical description. It was the word a junior analyst had used in a preliminary report and which had been struck from the official version, and which Veth had read in the preliminary version because she was thorough, and which had not entirely left her thinking since. The Perseverance had then continued to its destination. The Conclave Security Commission had seen the footage and convened an emergency session. The footage showed humans doing things to weapon systems they should not have had the technical capacity to do, using methods the Commission's weapons experts had described variously as unprecedented, improvised, and in one memorable phrase that had also been struck from the official record, deeply creative in a way that implies they have thought about this before. The demand for full weapons disclosure had been the Commission's unanimous recommendation. It had seemed at the time like the rational response. Mara Olin sent her response on the 4th day, not the 7th. Veth had anticipated the humans would use the full time allowed, and the early response was the first of several details about the following weeks that she filed and returned to repeatedly. The response was brief. It acknowledged the conclave's demand. It said that the matter was being given full consideration at the highest levels of human governance. It said that Coordinator Olin looked forward to continued dialogue. It did not say yes. It did not say no. It said, in the precise and careful language of someone who knows exactly what they are saying and exactly what they are not saying, that the conversation was continuing. The Conclave's legal team analyzed the response for 2 days and produced a 40-page assessment that concluded, among other things, that the humans appeared to be cooperating. Veth read it twice and disagreed quietly with her own team's conclusion, and did not say so in any official channel because she was still unable to articulate why. Over the next 6 weeks, the Conclave received 17 further responses from Coordinator Olin. Each one was polite. Each one confirmed ongoing internal discussions. Each one contained at least one sentence that, when extracted from the surrounding courtesy, seemed to be doing something more than courtesy did. Veth began keeping a private file of these sentences and reading them in sequence, and the thing she noticed when she read them in sequence was that they told a different story than the individual responses told. They were not stalling, they were waiting. And the distinction, Veth had the growing and deeply uncomfortable sense, was as significant as the distinction between the human name for the Keyleth Margin event and the Conclave's name for it. She requested a second meeting with Coordinator Olin. Olin agreed immediately, which was unexpected, and suggested a location that was not the Conclave's diplomatic station but a human commercial transit hub 3 light hours away, which was also unexpected. And when Veth arrived, she found the coordinator sitting at a table in what appeared to be an ordinary public food service establishment, eating something. "Ambassador," Olin said and gestured at the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming." "I thought," Veth began. "I know," Olin said. She said it the way people said things they had known for longer than the conversation had been happening. "The location is public," Olin said. "Civilian, no recording suppression fields, no diplomatic shielding, nothing your security team can read as threatening." She looked at Veth with an expression that, over the weeks of reviewing human interaction footage, Veth had tentatively identified as something adjacent to kindness. "I thought that might be more comfortable." Veth sat. Her security team arrayed themselves at a distance that was professional, and that Olin's 2 observers, seated at a nearby table, mirrored precisely without appearing to coordinate it. "What are you waiting for?" Veth asked. She had decided in transit to forego the careful language entirely. Olin set down whatever she had been eating and considered the question for a moment that was long enough to be genuine thinking, and short enough to suggest the thinking had mostly been done already. "Can I ask you something first?" she said. "Yes, the 3 munitions in the Keyleth Margin," Olin said. "They were Veth manufacture, your military's design. Do you know what our people found inside them?" Veth had read the technical reports. "Components consistent with inside the casing architecture," Olin said. "The inner design, the part that took our crew 19 days to map." Veth was quiet. "We weren't disabling them," Olin said. "We were reading them." She paused. It took 19 days because the design was very thorough. Whoever designed those systems put a great deal of thought into them. We wanted to understand all of that thought. Something shifted in Veth's understanding of the Keyleth margin event that was significant enough that she felt it physically, a slight reconfiguration of how her body was holding itself. The commission, Veth said slowly, believed your crew was disabling the munitions. I know, Olin said, you allowed that interpretation. Olin looked at her. No one asked us to clarify. If you had clarified, then you would have known what we learned, Olin said, and we would have needed to have a different conversation much earlier without enough time to have it properly. She picked up what she had been eating. We needed time. For what? Olin looked at the food in her hand, then at Veth. To decide, she said, how much of that conversation to have. Veth went back to her ship and did not sleep for 30 hours and wrote 4 drafts of a report to the commission and deleted all of them, because she could not find the language to explain the specific quality of what she had just understood. The humans had spent 19 days in a debris field with live munitions not because they had to. They had an option that would have taken 4 hours. They had spent 19 days there because they had decided to learn something, and the learning had taken 19 days, and they had emerged from it knowing something they had then spent 6 weeks deciding whether and how to reveal. The Conclave had issued a demand for human weapon systems. Veth was beginning to understand that the humans had known what was in the demand before the demand was issued, because they had already read its architecture. The question that followed from this understanding was so large that Veth stood at the observation port of her ship and looked at it for a long time without being able to see its edges. The official response arrived on the 61st day of the 90-day window. It was delivered not to the Conclave's diplomatic station but simultaneously to all 47 member civilizations, flagged as public diplomatic correspondence. A move that the Commission's legal team spent several hours determining was not technically a violation of any protocol because no protocol specifically covered it. Coordinator Olin had recorded it herself. She was seated at a plain table in a plain room, and she spoke in Terran standard with a translation overlay in the primary language of each recipient civilization, and she began not with the demand or the response to it but with a question. She asked the Conclave if they knew how many weapons systems existed in human possession. Not the systems in service, not the active military arsenal, which was what the demand had specified, all of them. Every system, archived or active, conventional or experimental, including systems currently in development. She asked the Conclave if they had, before issuing the demand, attempted to calculate that number. She said that she was going to tell them what the number was, and she asked them before she did to consider what the number implied about the conversation they were trying to have. Then she told them. The number was not large in the way the Commission had expected large to mean. It was not a count of devastating superweapons or city-killing platforms, the kinds of things the Commission's analysts had been anticipating and preparing containment protocols for. The number was something else entirely. The number was 11,473,218 discrete weapons designs archived in human databases since the beginning of recorded human history. 11 million. Olin let that settle for a moment that she had timed, Veth would later realize with a precision that was not accidental. Then she said that she wanted to explain what that number meant. Humanity, she said, had been building weapons for as long as it had been building anything. For every agriculture technique, every architectural innovation, every medical advance in human history, there existed a corresponding progression of violence, running parallel, feeding back, cross-pollinating in ways that humans had not always chosen and had not always been able to stop. The arrow that helped hunters feed families also cleared lands of people who were in the way. The metallurgy that built bridges also built swords. The chemistry that enabled fertilizers also enabled poison gas. The nuclear physics that could power a civilization could end one. This was not unique to humanity, Olin said. She was careful to say it was not unique to humanity. But humanity had been alone. For 120,000 years before first contact, humanity had been the only intelligent species it knew about, and in that isolation it had done what isolated things that are afraid do. It had kept building. Every threat it faced, it built a response to. Every response the threat built, it built a counter-response to. The process had no external moderator, no galactic authority, no third party to appeal to. The process was self-referential and self-escalating, and for 120,000 years it had fed on itself, and the result was 11 million distinct solutions to the problem of ending life, each one representing a chapter in a history of fear that no other spacefaring civilization had experienced in the same way, because no other spacefaring civilization had been alone for that long. What the Conclave was asking humanity to hand over, Olin said, was not an arsenal. It was a history, And the question she would like the conclave to consider before the response to the demand was formally issued was whether the conclave understood what it was asking to be responsible for. The recording ended. Veth watched it 4 times in a row, then she sat very still for a while. Then she accessed the preliminary report from the Keyleth margin analysis, the one with the struck phrases, and read it again. Then she did something she had not done since early in her career. She recorded a personal log and did not transmit it anywhere, just recorded it for herself because she needed to hear herself say the things she was thinking. They didn't let us see the munitions architecture, she said to the recording. They let us see that they had read it, and now they're letting us see that they've been reading everything. And what I don't know, what I still don't know, is what they've decided to do with what they've read. She stopped the recording. She thought about the human name for the Keyleth margin event. The waiting that was not waiting. She thought about what waiting looked like when it was not, in fact, waiting. The commission convened an emergency session. The session lasted 4 days. 3 different working groups were established to assess 3 different dimensions of what the human communication had implied. And when Veth presented her private assessment to the commission's presiding council, she chose her words with more care than she had chosen words in decades, because she had learned, watching coordinator Olin, what words chose not to say. She said that the human response had not answered the demand. She said that it had not refused the demand. She said that it had, in her assessment, restructured the demand, had taken the commission's framing of weapons as objects to be transferred and replaced it, quietly and precisely, with a different framing. Weapons as accumulated knowledge, and knowledge as something whose transfer could not be undone, and responsibility as something that had to be accepted before it could be handed over. The conclave had asked humanity to hand over its arsenal. Humanity had asked the conclave if it was sure it wanted to understand what that meant. The council was quiet for a long time. Then the presiding authority, a Dehelk elder named Soreth who had governed interstellar law for longer than humanity had been spacefaring, asked a question that silenced everyone in the chamber. Have we determined, Soreth asked, whether the humans have already begun transferring the information? Veth had not considered this question. She realized, in the moment it was asked, that she should have, and that the reason she hadn't was that she had still been thinking about the demand the way it had originally been framed, and that this was exactly the kind of conceptual limitation the human communication had been designed. She chose the word carefully in her own thinking, designed to reveal. The Commission's technical team spent 3 days auditing the Conclave's own weapons research archives, and what they found on the 3rd day was something that took Veth a long time to fully process even after she had read the report twice. There were 11,437 research papers, technical analyses, engineering assessments, and theoretical explorations distributed across Conclave databases in the preceding 90 years. They had come through ordinary academic and research channels. They were cited by Conclave researchers. Some of them had been foundational to certain Conclave defensive systems. The authorship was distributed across a range of apparently unrelated human research institutions and individual researchers. They had not been disguised. They had not been hidden. They were simply present, in ordinary places, doing ordinary things, and what they collectively constituted, when the technical team mapped their interdependencies and traced their combined implications, was a framework. A complete, functioning, integrated framework for understanding the architecture of weapons systems designed by 11 million distinct historical processes, and the relationships between those processes and the defensive systems that had been built in response to them. The humans had not waited for the demand to begin thinking about how knowledge moved. The humans had been moving it for 90 years, not secretly, not illegally. In the open, through channels that any Conclave researcher could access piece by piece in a way that only became visible as a whole when you already knew to look for it. Veth read the report and then she read it again and then she stood very still for a very long time, because she had been a diplomat for 40 years and she understood what she was looking at, and what she was looking at was not a threat and not an invasion and not a deception. It was the opposite of a deception. It was total, complete, utterly deniable transparency, the kind that could only be called transparency if you knew what you were reading, and which looked like ordinary research if you didn't. The Conclave had asked humanity to hand over its arsenal. Humanity had already been doing it, not as weapons, as understanding, piece by piece through academic channels for 90 years, in a way that gave the Conclave's own researchers the tools to understand the framework without ever being told they were being given the tools, and which could therefore not be refused, contained, or redirected, because you cannot refuse knowledge that you have already used to build your own systems. Veth went back to the chamber where she had first met Coordinator Olin and sat in the same chair she had sat in and looked at the table. 11 seconds of silence. She had thought the silence was hesitation. The second formal meeting between Veth and Coordinator Olin happened not because Veth requested it but because Olin did, which was a distinction that felt important in ways Veth was still calibrating. The location this time was the Conclave Diplomatic Station, Olin's choice. The young man with the scar was there again, and the older woman with white hair, and Veth had requested profiles on both of them and received files that were thorough, and which told her something she had not expected. The young man was a structural engineer who specialized in damage assessment, and the older woman was a historian whose primary area of study was the long-term institutional consequences of disarmament treaties. Neither of them was, in any formal sense, a weapons expert or a diplomat or a security professional. Beth thought about this during the transit. She thought about what it meant to bring a damage assessor and a disarmament historian to a meeting about weapons. You knew about the research framework, Veth said when they were seated. Yes, Olin said, you knew we would find it. We knew you would find it when you were ready to look, Olin said, which is different. The Commission believes the framework constitutes a form of unauthorized technology transfer. The Commission can make that argument, Olin said. There are researchers at 17 conclave institutions who will find it very interesting, since their own published work cites the framework papers extensively. Beth had known this. She had known it before coming, and she had come anyway because there was a question she needed to ask, and she had not been able to find a way to ask it through any other channel. What do you want? She asked. Olin looked at her. The expression on the human woman's face was one that Veth had been cataloging for months across recordings and meeting footage and now in person, and she had finally decided it was not, as she had initially assessed, a kind of calculation. It was something older than calculation. It was the expression of someone who had already been to the place the conversation was going and had come back from it and had decided to let the conversation go there anyway because the going was necessary. The same thing you want, Olin said. Stability, safety, a galaxy where what happened in the Keyleth margin doesn't happen again. 3 live munitions in a debris field. There were 47, Olin said. Veth's translator rendered this perfectly, and Veth sat with it for a moment. The report said 3. The Conclave's observation vessels detected 3, Olin said. Our crew found 47, the other 44 were at configurations the observation vessel's sensors weren't calibrated to detect. She paused. We disarmed all 47. The documentation is in one of the framework papers. It's not labeled as Keyleth margin documentation. You'd have to know what you're looking for. 47, not 3, 47. And the observation vessels, the Conclave's own vessels, stationed for survey, equipped with military-grade detection systems, had seen 3. The humans had spent 19 days in a debris field with 47 live munitions because only they could see all 47 of them. And they had disarmed all 47. And they had documented how in a research paper that was currently sitting in Conclave academic archives, accessible to any researcher who needed it. And they had said nothing. They had not said, your observation vessels have a calibration gap. They had not said, we found more than you could see. They had not filed an incident report. They had gone into the debris field and done the work and come out the other side and continued to their destination, and the documentation existed for anyone who was ready to look for it. The calibration gap, Veth said slowly. Our sensors are very good, Olin said. The gap is narrow, but it's there. She met Veth's eyes. We didn't put it there? No, Veth said, you found it. We find things, Olin said simply. It's what we do, it's what 120,000 years of being alone and afraid teaches you to do. You look for what's there, not just what you expect to be there. Veth thought about the Commission's demand, the full disclosure and transfer of all human weapons systems, the confidence behind it. The certainty that the humans would be overwhelmed by the weight of conclave authority, that compliance was inevitable, that the only question was timing. If we had pushed the demand, Veth said, if we had enforced it at 90 days, we would have complied, Olin said. With what? The human coordinator was quiet for a moment that felt to Veth like the edge of something very large. That, Olin said, was the question we spent 6 weeks deciding whether to answer. The older woman, the historian whose name was Dr. Kala Ren, spoke for the first time in the meeting. Ambassador, she said, may I ask what the Commission believes it would do with 11 million weapons designs? Veth looked at her. Assess them, contain them, ensure they couldn't be deployed without conclave oversight. Over what period of time? The Commission estimated 5 to 10 years for initial assessment. Ren nodded slowly in the way of someone who has done the corresponding calculation many times. In 5 to 10 years, she said, the Commission would understand perhaps 12 to 15% of the designs, the ones that translate most cleanly into conclave technical frameworks, the ones that map onto weapons architectures the Commission's experts already recognize. She paused. The others would be sitting in a repository, archived, accessible. In a facility staffed by researchers who would spend years slowly building enough context to understand what they were looking at. The Commission's experts are very good, Ren said, the echo of Olin's phrasing deliberate. But context is not expertise, context is history. The Commission's experts would have the designs without the 120,000 years of fear that generated them. Without the accumulated scar tissue of every civilization that ever encountered one of those designs on the wrong end of it. Without understanding why each one was built, what it was built in response to, what it was designed to make impossible. She folded her hands on the table. What you would have, Ambassador, is a repository of answers to questions you don't know to ask. Veth thought about the framework papers in Conclave archives. The way they had moved knowledge piece by piece in context, attached to the reasoning that made the knowledge meaningful rather than just dangerous. And what the framework papers do, Veth said slowly, is give context before content, Ren said. Build the vocabulary before the text arrives. Ensure that whoever receives the information receives it already knowing enough to understand it rather than merely possessing it. The framework papers, Veth said, they weren't the transfer. They were the preparation for the transfer. Olin and Ren were quiet. You've been preparing us, Veth said. For 90 years, you've been building the contextual architecture in conclave research before sending anything that would require that architecture to understand safely. We've been having the conversation, Olin said, in the only form the conversation can safely take. The young man with the scar, the damage assessor, said his first and only words of the meeting. His name was Tarek. Veth had not addressed him and he had not volunteered himself, and when he spoke it was quietly, almost to himself, except that the room was silent enough that everyone heard it. My job, he said, is to walk into places after bad things happen and figure out what broke and how, not to assign blame, just to understand the structure well enough that you know what to shore up next time. He was looking at the table when he said it. I've been in buildings after fires, after collapses, after things that weren't supposed to be able to fail. And the pattern is always the same. The failure is never in the structure you were watching, it's in the connection between structures you didn't think to check. He looked up. 47 munitions, not 3. He did not say anything after that. Veth looked at him and then at Olin and then at Ren, and she thought about the architecture of what had just been laid in front of her. A damage assessor, because the meeting was about understanding what breaks. A historian, because the meeting was about understanding why knowledge without context is the architecture of failure. A coordinator who had left a translation earpiece on a table 11 weeks ago and never asked for it back. They had brought exactly the right people, as they had been doing apparently for 90 years. The Commission's formal response to Coordinator Olin's communication was issued 17 days later. It withdrew the demand in its current form and proposed a joint working group to develop a framework for collaborative weapons knowledge review. A framework that would, in the Commission's careful diplomatic language, draw upon existing research collaborations and build upon established academic channels. It was an acknowledgement, written in the language of institutional face-saving, that the humans had already been doing the thing the demand had asked for, in the only way that made the thing safe to do, and that the conclave was now going to officially participate in a process that had been running without official participation for nearly a century. Veth delivered the response personally. Olin read it at the table in the same chamber where the silence had lasted 11 seconds, and when she looked up her expression was not triumph. It was something that Veth had finally, after months of trying, found the right word for. It was relief, not the relief of winning, the relief of something that had been held for a very long time finally being held by more hands. One question, Veth said. Yes, the framework papers, the research distribution, the 90-year preparation. Veth paused. Did you know when it started that it would take 90 years? Olin was quiet for a moment that Veth recognized now as genuine thinking. The people who started it knew it would take a long time, she said. They didn't know how long. They started it because they had worked out that the conversation was necessary and that the conversation couldn't be rushed and that the preparation had to come before anyone was ready to have the conversation. She looked at the response document. Most of the people who started it didn't live to see this meeting. Veth sat with that for a moment. Human lifespans were approximately 80 to 90 years. The preparation had taken 90 years. The people who had begun it had known when they began that they were building something they would not be present for, that the conversation they were preparing the galaxy to have would happen after they were gone. That the work was necessary and the work was long and they had begun it anyway and trusted that others would continue it. Why? Veth asked, and she was not asking about tactics or strategy or diplomatic positioning. She was asking the other question, the one underneath. Because 47 munitions, Olin said, not 3, she looked at Veth steadily. Because we've been in the debris field, we know what's there. And we know what happens when someone who doesn't know what's there goes in without preparation. She picked up the response document. We've been the things in the debris field, Ambassador, for a long time. We know what it feels like to be encountered by someone who can only see part of you and assumes the part they can see is all of you. Veth walked back to her ship in the kind of quiet that is not silence but the opposite of it, the quiet of a mind processing too much to allow noise. She thought about 47 instead of 3. She thought about 90 years of preparation for a conversation no one in the first generation would survive to complete. She thought about 11 million weapons designs that were, underneath the accumulated fear that had generated them, a history of a species trying to survive in an empty galaxy with nothing to negotiate with except itself. She thought about the translation earpiece on the table. The deliberate gap between what the document said and what the conclave's position actually was. The careful, precise, patient work of people who understood that the most dangerous thing in any encounter was not the weapon in the room but the incomplete picture in the observer's mind. She thought about the waiting that was not waiting, and she understood finally what the human name for the Keyleth margin event actually meant. It was not about the 19 days in the debris field. It was about the 90 years before it. The waiting that looked like waiting but was underneath, the most sustained and deliberate act of preparation the galaxy had witnessed without recognizing it. The patience of a species that had learned, through 120,000 years of being its own worst enemy, that the only way to give someone something dangerous was to spend a very long time first making sure they were ready to hold it. Not because the humans were generous, not because they were peaceful. Because they understood, at a level carved into them by an isolation no other spacefaring species had endured, what happened when dangerous knowledge moved without its context, when weapons transferred without their history, when you handed someone the answer to a question they didn't know they were asking. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They did not have the most powerful ships or the oldest institutions or the most sophisticated sensors. They were the species that had walked into a debris field with 47 invisible munitions and spent 19 days reading each one, and had documented everything they learned and had said nothing about it, and had trusted that the galaxy would eventually be ready to look for what they had left behind. And they had been right. And that the willingness to work in a timeline that outlasted individual lives, to prepare for conversations that had not yet become necessary, to move knowledge like water through channels that didn't look like channels, to be present in a situation in a way that wasn't visible until you knew what you were looking for, that was not a weapon, and it was not a diplomatic strategy, and it was not a military capability. It was something older. It was what you became when you spent 120,000 years afraid and alone and had to figure out, generation by generation, how to survive not just the threats outside you but the ones you built yourself. The galaxy had looked at humanity and seen an arsenal. What Veth had been sitting across from for 11 weeks was a civilization that had already disarmed itself the only way that actually worked, not by surrendering its knowledge, but by spending a century making sure the people who needed to share that knowledge were ready to understand what they were holding. She stood at the observation port of her ship and looked at the stars and thought about the munitions no one else could see, and the papers in the archive no one had thought to read as a whole, and the people who had begun a 90-year conversation knowing they would not live to hear the answer. Somewhere, a damage assessor was already writing his next report. Somewhere, a historian was already noting the date. And the galaxy, which had demanded that humanity hand over its arsenal, was only beginning to understand that humanity had been doing exactly that for longer than the Conclave had thought to look, and that the truly frightening thing was not the 11 million designs, or the 47 invisible munitions, or even the calibration gap in Conclave sensors that humans had found and documented and quietly waited for someone else to be ready to know about. The truly frightening thing was the patience. The titanically, incomprehensibly, serenely patient willingness to begin a work that would not be finished in your lifetime, to trust that it would be continued, to believe, without evidence, without guarantee, without any promise from a galaxy that had not yet even noticed you were trying, that the conversation was worth having even if you would never hear how it ended. That was not strength, that was not strategy. That was something the galaxy had no category for and no defense against, and Veth realized, standing at the observation port in the dark between stars, no desire to defend against. Because somewhere in the architecture of that patience was the only thing that had ever actually made any civilization safe. The knowledge that some things were worth starting even when you wouldn't survive to finish them. And the humans, alone in their debris field for 120,000 years, had learned that lesson so deeply it had become the structure of everything they built, including the careful and unhurried work of teaching it to everyone else.